In studying the Cultural Revolution and its aftermath, we have to focus on this idea of Red Terror and the use of terror and anarchy in the essential will of Mao, essentially doing Mao's bidding, and how this was actually implemented. And that's what we're going to do in this lesson and the next lesson as well. So in the previous lesson, we introduced the next of our substantive topics, specifically focusing on the impact of the Cultural Revolution on China. And in this lesson, we're going to begin by examining some of the key events which took place during the early stages of the revolution. And we're going to look at the impact of these early initiatives and how we go from the basic understanding of the Cultural Revolution, the basic instruments that were implemented as a result of the Cultural Revolution, how we went from that to the chaos and anarchy that the Cultural Revolution would eventually become. And one of the key elements that was important for Mao in the utilization of control during the Cultural Revolution was the utilization of young people. Now, essentially, Mao was very beneficial in the sense that he could utilize young people during the Cultural Revolution because young people had not really known, or they had not really remembered, the impact of Maoist politics on the state of China. So by the time the Cultural Revolution would begin and the Cultural Revolution would begin to take shape, the idea of the Great Famine and the Great Leap Forward and Lysenkoism and the Four Pests campaign, all of these different ideas that Mao had implemented that led to the deaths of tens of millions of people, all of these things were a distant memory, especially to young people. To older people they were not, of course, but to young people they were a distant memory. And so their understanding of the Great Famine and the extent to which Mao was responsible was very limited. They may have understood what the Great Famine was, they may have been told about it, but they may not have been told that Mao was responsible for it. And so therefore the situation was ripe for Mao to be able to establish a cult of personality around him, again, a new cult of personality, and using young people to do so. So rather than suggesting that Mao was to blame for the Great Famine, children and young people in communist China were simply taught that Mao was a great hero and the great hero of the Chinese Civil War. And so therefore Mao came along and defeated the nationalists who had then fled to Taiwan. And so we see Mao being presented in this almost godlike characterization. So essentially, rather than teaching the young people of the next generation of Chinese society that that Mao was responsible for all the terrible things like the Great Famine, they said instead that Mao was this great hero of the Chinese Civil War. They focused on the positive elements of Maoist thought and Mao's ideas. And so therefore, at the start of the Cultural Revolution, Mao was presented in a relatively positive light. He was presented especially in a very positive light by young people, and he was able to utilize this idea and utilize this positive image to create a cult of personality. One of the ways in which he was able to do this and to disseminate information which enshrined this cult of personality was through the distribution of Mao's quote-unquote Little Red Book. The Little Red Book was commissioned by Lin Bao in 1964, and included a number of famous quotes and sentiments that were spoken and believed by Mao himself. So essentially what this did was enshrine an idea known as Mao Zedong thought, the kind of political philosophy of Mao, if you will. And it was presented in this Little Red Book. Every member of the PLA was ordered to own a copy of the Little Red Book, and they were told that they had to read it. The popularity of the book would then spread into the younger generations and into young people. Mao Zedong thought this kind of political philosophy that Mao enshrined would take on a spiritual meaning. There were reports, obviously false reports, that the Little Red Book and that Mao Zedong thought was able to cure the sick and to heal the injured. There was even one instance where the idea of the Little Red Book was able to bring somebody back from the dead as a result of the just enshrined spiritual political philosophy that Mao had envisaged. This further entrenched the idea that there existed a cult of personality, as you can probably imagine. When you take a leader and you present them in such a spiritual, almost deified presentation, this gives a certain degree of cult of personality, as you can probably imagine. And so with this being said, we are setting the stage for what would eventually become the mass anarchy that was the Cultural Revolution itself. And in 1966, Mao, along with a number of others, so some of the most ardent supporters, including Lin Biao, organized rallies for students to attend in Beijing. And these would become mass rallies. During these rallies, Mao would speak in such a way as to stir up further with the different revolutionary ideas and revolutionary intentions. What is important about this is that we have to take this idea of these mass rallies, the way in which he spoke at these mass rallies, we have to take this in conjunction with the cult of personality that was already beginning to take shape, and all of these ideas related to the Little Red Book. So Mao was already a spiritual figure at this point, and the way in which he spoke enshrined further revolutionary ideas and intentions into the minds of the young individuals who were trying to follow his wishes. He would declare to the students that the future of China belonged to them, and that they would need to stamp out the bourgeois feudal classes. This all went along with the general encouragement for students to join what became known as the Red Guards. Now, the Red Guards were groups of young individuals who would be completely dedicated to the ideas, the teachings, the wishes, and the orders of Mao Zedong. So we have the mass rallies that would then encourage more and more people to join the Red Guards. The Red Guards were mostly made up of young individuals, students, and other dedicated, devoted individuals to Mao Zedong himself. And so, with all this being said, we have the melting pot for what becomes a mass revolution, a cultural revolution. And this is then enshrined by Mao's initiation of the Four Olds campaign. In August 1966, the Four Olds campaign is introduced. It is launched. Now, what is the Four Olds campaign? Well, it is a campaign against four specific things, four old things. Specifically, old ideas, old culture, old customs, and old habits. These are all the different things that Mao wanted to teach against and to try and stamp out within Chinese society. Along with the growing cult of personality, this would be enough to really essentially light the touch paper and to start the revolution. And so the Cultural Revolution would begin to take shape. This idea that old beliefs ought to be replaced with these new conceptions of communism and the instigation of a quote-unquote permanent revolution. We made clear that in the last lesson, when we introduced the Cultural Revolution, that one of Mao's key beliefs was that younger generations did not know what it was like to go through a revolutionary struggle like they had done in the Chinese Civil War, which ended in 1949. These new individuals in the 1960s didn't have any idea of what this actually meant. And so for Mao, the idea of a permanent revolution so that new generations can experience what it was like to go through a revolutionary struggle was something that was very important to him.